Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who's logged on from around the world to this first edition of a new learning series on red forestry and climate. We are very happy that you're here and excited to kick off this new learning event. My name is Nina Dötencham from the Facility Management Team of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, and I will be your host today. In today's session, you will learn about the methodological framework of the Carbon Fund of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. The methodological framework was approved by the Carbon Fund participants last year in December in Paris. That was a very important milestone for the Carbon Fund, as it kicked off, allowed us to guide the development of large-scale REDD programs that are aimed to protect tropical forests and enhance the livelihoods of local communities. Today, you will have the privilege to have the methodological framework explained by Marco van der Linden, who is one of the co-leads in developing the framework. Marco has more than 10 years of experience working on climate finance. He has been with the Carbon Finance Unit for 4 years and has previously worked with the UNFCCC Secretariat. Now, before I hand over to Marco, I would just want to make a few comments. This series will be recorded, so you will have access to it within 1 day after this session and can go back to it if you weren't able to capture all. We will have a one-hour presentation that Marco will provide, and then we'll have plenty of time, about half an hour, for your questions. If you have extremely burning questions, you're more than welcome to type them in as we go along. I would like to hand over to Marco.
Nina. Yes, good morning, good afternoon from my side as well. So, as Nina said, we have about an hour for the presentation, and since it's quite long, well, let's just get started straight away. So the idea of today is to talk about the methodological framework for the FCPF Carbon Fund. So for those of you that might not know that much about the FCPF and the Carbon Fund, just a little bit of background information. The Carbon Fund is part of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, which is which is a facility that brings together donors and REDD countries to talk about REDD. And the Carbon Fund is one of the two funds in the FCPF. And the Carbon Fund is designed to pay for emission reductions from large-scale REDD Plus programs from a limited number of REDD countries. So the idea is really to pilot something. And that piloting will, at the moment, the Carbon Fund is scheduled to end in 2020, so we're piloting this program between now and that end date. What the Carbon Fund will do is it will pay for those emission reductions during the lifetime of the contract, so that means between now or whenever a contract will be signed and 2020. And we'll get back to some of these dates later on as well. To make the technology work. Thank you. If you want more information on the Carbon Fund and what it does and how it exactly works, we have a couple of brochures on our website, and we'll give you the link later on. And if you have any questions and you're an FCPF participant, you can also go to your focal point. So on the methodological framework itself, so as I said before, the Carbon Fund is going to pilot large-scale payments for emission reductions in a limited number of REDD countries. So when the Carbon Fund was thinking about how we're going to do that, there was a decision that we need some sort of a standard that will guide ER programs these programs when countries are developing a program, we need some sort of a standard to help them guide them. So that's what basically the methodological framework is. It's a standard for ER programs which consists of a set of criteria and indicators. And then meeting that set of criteria and indicators is one of the requirements to enter into the FCPF Carbon Fund. It's not the only requirement. There will be other things. You need to meet, for example, World Bank safeguard policies. But the methodological framework and the criteria and indicators in the Met framework are a very important part of the selection process. Now, the methodological framework is designed specifically for the FCPF Carbon Fund, but it strives to be consistent with the UNFCCC guidance. But you will see once we start going through it, there's some parts where maybe the Carbon Fund has its own rules, or it's a little bit more restrictive. Since it's a set of criteria and indicators, the methodological framework is not super detailed. So it's not a cookbook that will give you all the rules and all the step-by-step ways of doing things. Rather, it sort of sets a general framework for you to develop a program, but within that framework, there's room for countries and programs to come up with their own solutions. But to help you to develop programs, the Carbon Fund will be providing additional operational information and non-binding good practice, which will be made available on the FCPF website. There's also expectation that as we go along, since the Carbon Fund is a piloting effort, that from what we learn from these pilots, we will be able to improve the methodological framework over time as programs are implemented and lessons are learned. So what's covered by the methodological framework? Basically, the framework consists of 5 major parts: level of ambition, carbon accounting, safeguards, sustainable program design and implementation, and program transactions. So in this webinar, we'll go into each of these sections in a little bit more detail. But obviously, there's not going to be time to cover everything. So I still encourage you very much to go to the FCPF website, find the methodological framework, and read it yourself, because there's a lot of details in there which we cannot cover in an hour like this. To start off with the first one. So the first one was the level of ambition. That basically talks about the expectations in terms of the size of the programs and how you're going to be implementing and how you're going to be accounting that. So what the methodological framework says is you need to define something which we call an ER program accounting area. And this is the area where you will be implementing your RED activities, but it's also the area for which the reference level will be estimated and the emission reductions will be calculated. So if we have a country A, you would define a reference level, let's say that gray part on the slide, and that will be the area where you would do your reference level, your MRV, and your activities. Now, the methodological framework requires that the accounting area is of a significant scale and aligns with one or more jurisdictions or government-designated areas. So jurisdictions depends on the circumstance of your country, but it could be a province, could be a district, could be a state, depending on how the country is organized, or it could be an eco-region. But what is important, again, is that the reference level and the monitoring and reporting is done for the whole accounting area, so wall-to-wall basically. So that has consequences when you start thinking about, okay, we want to do a program, we want to do a RED program, and we want to apply the methodological framework. Okay, what's the consequence? So let's assume we have 2 identical situations. So similar as on the same slide, we have a country, which is the bluish area, and then we have an accounting area within that country, which is the gray area. So if you have one program that has a lot of activities and covers a lot of areas, the one on the left-hand side, versus one where where you have a limited set of activities, for example, you're creating a new protected area. But the accounting area is still the big gray area. So in the right-hand situation, you might have a chance that deforestation is still occurring somewhere outside where you're doing your interventions, but still within the accounting area. And remember, we're doing it at a reference level and we're doing the MRV for the whole accounting area, so for the whole gray area. So on the right-hand side, all the emission reductions that you might create to your RED Plus program might be wiped out by increased emissions that are still happening in your accounting area. So it's very important to think about, okay, what's that trade-off? How much area can we influence through a RED program? what are my measures, what are my policies that will create emission reductions, and how does that connect to this accounting area that I need to define, which is the area where I'll do my reference level, my MRV, and is there a chance that there will be major emissions occurring in that area that will not be covered by my activities? And that could be a potential risk for your program. So that's really something to think about. So you can be very ambitious and say we're going to do a program that covers half the country. But if you're not impacting all of that area through the activities that you're implementing, that might have an effect once you start doing your reference level and your MRV. So the key points is work at a large scale, cover a significant portion of the territory, but think about this accounting area that you need to define where your results will be measured against the reference level. And the measurement is wall to wall, so it will also cover areas that are not necessarily covered by your program activities. So once you define that accounting area, then we actually move to the accounting of the emission and emission reductions. So what the methodological framework of the FCPF requires is that every program must account for emissions from deforestation. So out of the 5 red activities, deforestation, degradation, enhancement, conservation, etc., every program needs to do deforestation. Then you also need to account for degradation where that is considered significant. And significant is defined as more than 10% of forest-related emissions in the accounting area. But the methodological framework recognizes that for a lot of countries there's not that much information on forest degradation. So it allows you to estimate degradation through the use of proxies. So proxies could, for example, be that in the field you see a situation that, okay, we know there's degradation in an area, 2 kilometers from a village or 1 kilometer from a road. So you can use the presence of a village or a road to estimate your degradation without actually having to go in and do field measurements of how much the degradation is. You could develop some sort of a model and then say, okay, we assume that around each village there's X degradation in a sort of an area of 2 kilometers, something like that. So that way it can be a little bit creative, but if degradation is significant, you will be expected to find a solution for that. Then on the other red activities, carbon stock enhancements, conservation, etc., you have flexibility to include it. But if you include it as part of your program design, so you say, okay, we're going to do a program where we're going to do major reforestation, for example, you also need to include it in your reference level. It's very important that there's consistency between the activities that you choose in your reference level and the activities that you do in your MRV. And in terms of carbon pools, so carbon pools are things like above ground biomass, below ground biomass, soil carbon, etc. They must be included except where the exclusion underestimates emission reductions or where the pool is not significant. So when we say where exclusion would underestimate emission reduction, what does that mean? Well, one example is, for example, soil carbon. So you can imagine a situation that if in the baseline scenario, in your reference level, there will be deforestation, and that deforestation would lead to soil degradation, therefore soil carbon loss. If you exclude that soil carbon pool from your accounting, you're basically underestimating the emissions that you reduce by saving the forest. So that would be conservative. You would underestimate your emission reductions. And one of the reasons why you might want to do that is that sometimes it's very costly or complicated to get proper information about some of these pools like soil carbon. So there's a trade-off there. What's the benefit of including this pool against the cost of actually having to come up with estimates for that pool? And that's a trade-off that you will need to make when you're designing your system and when you're designing your program and your monitoring system. Then when we start setting a reference level and monitoring emission reductions, we know there's uncertainties associated with that. Uncertainties which arise from estimating your reference level, doing your measurements, etc. So the methodological framework requires 3 steps to manage that uncertainty. The first step is basically that you identify and assess all the sources of uncertainty, and assess how much they would contribute to the overall uncertainty of the emission reductions and removals. Second step is trying to minimize that uncertainty where feasible and cost effective. So there could be different ways depending on what the sources of the errors are, but sometimes it means good measurement practices, good procedures, proper training of crews, etc. Sometimes it's just sampling. So, if you put in more sample plots, for example, for measuring carbon stocks, you might be able to reduce your overall uncertainty. But some uncertainty might be remaining, and the Carbon Fund does not set an absolute threshold. It doesn't tell you that your uncertainty needs to be lower than X. But what it says is that once you've done your best, you need to quantify the remaining uncertainty, and then set it, and then based on that quantification, part of your emission reductions will be set aside in a buffer. And that set aside will be based on a number of conservativeness factors which are defined in the methodological framework, and each of these factors is related to a certain uncertainty range. And there's different factors there for uncertainty that comes from measurements versus uncertainty that comes from the use of these proxies. So you remember when we were saying that that for forest degradation you can use proxies. The methodological framework recognizes that these proxies have a much higher uncertainty associated with it. So there's different discount factors if you do degradation and you use proxies to estimate that. So the next part of the carbon accounting is the actual reference level. So as in, most of you will be used to when we're talking about RED, the emission reductions from an ER program are measured and reported against a reference level. The requirement of the methodological framework is that you set this reference level for the ER accounting area. So again, the ER accounting area is a district or a province or an eco-region, whatever you've selected for your program, and the reference level is set for that whole area. So if we have two examples, one with lower emissions and one with higher emissions, and the reference level would be something like this red line. The left-hand case would be able to create emission reductions up against the reference level as the difference between the reference level and the actual monitored emissions. Well, the right-hand case, because the emissions are higher than the reference level, there will be no emission reductions. I think it's pretty straightforward, and I assume that most people will understand that by now. Then what the methodological framework of the Carbon Fund requires is that the reference level is based on annual average historic emissions and removals if you include that in the scope. And this annual average historic emissions is calculated over a period of about 10 years that ends at the most recent date prior to 2013, so basically 2012. And the date is related to when forest cover data is available to enable IPCC Approach 3. So just to clarify, we're talking about IPCC Approach 3, which is the approach that says that you have to be spatially explicit. I'm not talking about IPCC Tier 3, which is the level of detail that you have in your emission factors. But basically what it says you need to have spatially explicit forest cover data, and ideally the most recent date for that will be 2012. So in the left-hand example, if we have 3 points, we would calculate annual average historic emissions. It would look something like that. It's not exact, but basically it's one number, it's a flat line, and that number would be your reference level going forward if you're developing a program. But then it's recognized that certain countries might have certain circumstances why you want to change that reference period, so that the 10 years over which you calculate the annual historic average. So it says that an alternative end date or start date can be allowed if you can justify it. And one type of justification, for example, could be, where you say, okay, we just happen to have had a forest inventory that we completed in 2010, and we would like to use that as the end date. That is possible. In that case, you could have a period running for, instead of 2002, 2012, it could be 2000 or 2010, or maybe you want to use a slightly earlier starting date because you did an inventory in 1998 or something like that. So that's allowed. You can move that reference period around a little bit, but the reference period itself cannot be more than 15 years. And again, the end date of the reference period should be as close to 2013 as possible. If you go too far back, it will be hard to justify that. So that's something to keep in mind. Annual average historic emissions over a period in, let's say, roughly 2000-2012. So the fact that the methodological framework requires average and historic has some consequences, especially if you are thinking about doing a program for the Carbon Fund or for some sort of another standard or donor. So if you're in a situation like what we see on the screen now, and you have an area where emissions are developing like this, so it seems like they're going up. So you could say, well, we think there's an upward trend there. But again, the requirement of the methodological framework would be that you use average annual emissions during the reference period as your reference level. So if you really have a trend going on, and we have a program that starts in, let's say, 2015, if you follow the trend, the first, the emissions at the beginning of your program would be something like that blue point over there. And if you then start implementing a program, slowly reducing emissions, because the Carbon Fund says your reference level is the average annual historic emissions, so the red line, you won't actually be creating emission reductions until you had that last point where you actually are below that red line. So that's very important. If you're thinking about doing a program and you're thinking about the selection of the area, and it is an area which is still having major increase in emissions, the question is, okay, can I actually do a program that can reduce emissions below my annual average? Keeping in mind, as I said in the beginning, that the Carbon Fund is at the moment scheduled to end in 2020. So you'll need to be able to reduce your emissions by 2020. So if there's major increase in emissions still going on in your country or in a particular area, that might be something that is a potential problem for creating actual emission reductions. So to finish up on the reference level, as I said before, the reference level in the terms of the methodological framework is specific for the accounting area, and the accounting area is the area where you do your program for the Carbon Fund. At the same time, as a country, you might be developing a reference level on your national readiness, or maybe you're planning to submit that to the UNFCCC soon. What the methodological framework recognizes is that, okay, these processes can go in parallel, so you don't have to have a national level forest reference level under the UNFCCC before you can do a reference level for the Carbon Fund. You could do your Carbon Fund reference level first and use that to inform your UNFCCC level reference level. Up to you, but it would be good if there's consistency in terms of methods and data. Now, if based on the, when you're constructing the reference level, based on the available data, if you see there's a clear downward trend, you should take that into account in the construction of the reference level. So again, the assumption is that your reference level is average annual historic emissions. But if there's a clear downward trend, then that downward trend should be considered when putting in your reference level. The methodological framework does not require you to collect extra information to show if there's a trend or not. So if you have a limited set of data points and you're not sure if there's a downward trend or not, there's not a requirement for you to put in more data. It is based on the data that you already have. Now, for a limited set of countries, there's also a possibility to do an upward trend. So an upward adjustment of the historic emissions. this is only for countries that historically have low deforestation rates and high forest cover. So what in the sort of red jargon we call HFLD. So they can take their annual average historic emissions, which are usually low, and do a upward adjustments, which is based, and I'm just reading it now, expected emissions that would result from documented changes in the program circumstances that are evident before the end date, but the effects are not fully reflected in the average annual historic emissions. So again, it's an adjustment that can only be made for very few countries, and if those countries want to do an adjustment, they need to justify that emissions would go up, and that needs to be documented and clearly explained. So that will be a discussion that you would have with the Carbon Fund participants on, can we justify this upward adjustment? And then the methodological framework puts in a cap on this adjustment, which is 0.1% per year of the total carbon stocks. But again, for most countries, the reference level is just going to be average annual historic emissions. Okay, so that's the reference level. Then we're going to hopefully implement the program, and you will need to do your measurement reporting, monitoring and reporting of the actual emissions from your program, and that will be the basis for the calculation of the emission reductions. So as I said before, when you set your accounting area, when you start thinking about the activities that you want to include, deforestation, degradation, forest carbon stock enhancements, the carbon pools that you select, the idea is that you're going to be consistent between the reference level and what your MRV. So if you only put above ground biomass deforestation in your reference level, that's what you will monitor. The monitoring system will need to be able to determine the emission reductions, obviously, and it needs to be able to determine that during the term of the ERPA. An ERPA is a term that means Emission Reduction Payment Agreement, which is basically the contract that will exist between the program and the Carbon Fund, which will set the rules for the payments. So that ERPA will be signed if a program is selected by the Carbon Fund. So let's say 2015, and that will run until the end of the Carbon Fund lifetime, let's say 2020. So the Carbon Fund will only pay for emission reductions created in that period, let's say 5 years. Now, the Carbon Fund recognizes that you might have programs and RED activities that have started before. Maybe you've implemented the RED strategy in 2012 and you're already creating emission reductions before 2015. And that's fine. You can still use the methodological framework to estimate those emission reductions, but the Carbon Fund will only pay for the emission reductions in the period of this contract, of this ERPA. So that means that the monitoring system will need to be able to identify the amount of emission reductions created in that period. Now, what the methodological framework requires is that when you do your monitoring, you need to determine the land use changes, and you need to determine the emission factors or the carbon stocks. The changes in the land use need to be measured at least twice during the lifetime of the ERPA, while the emission factors, so the carbon stocks, can be determined once, although as a program you can choose to voluntarily improve them, and as you go along developing your program. And the idea is that the monitoring system that you're building for the program is not necessarily specific for the program, but it builds on the national monitoring system that you are already developing as part of your national readiness. So at least it should apply the same technical specifications. Again, recognizing that maybe your program is moving faster than some of the national RED activities, so you can use the program to test certain things out and inform the design of your national monitoring system as it develops. Now, another component of the whole accounting is accounting for displacement. What is displacement? If you're implementing your program as you've seen before, so you have your accounting area, which is the gray area again, you're doing certain measures. You might have a situation that because of the things that you do in your program, for example, you create a new protected area, the things that were driving deforestation and the agents that were creating deforestation might move to an area outside your accounting area. which means that emissions increase outside your accounting area, but still within the country, or maybe even in a neighboring country. So that's what we call displacement. So displacement is emissions occurring outside the program boundary, so outside the accounting area, as a consequence of the activities that you implement. What the methodological framework requires is that, first of all, you identify sources of displacement and assess their risk. Then you develop and implement a strategy to minimize or mitigate the displacement. And then you report on the changes in the drivers. What the methodological framework does not require is that you try to quantify any displacement and then try to subtract that from your emission reductions. So for those of you who are used to working on a sort of a project scale, maybe under the CDM or the VCS standard way, you had to quantify leakage or displacement and then subtract that. The methodological framework is saying, because we're working at this big scale, it's almost impossible to quantify the effects of displacement. So the emphasis is really on good program design and not so much on trying to quantify it. Now the final part of accounting is the accounting for reversals. So reversals is a situation where the cumulative monitored and verified emission reductions are less than what has been transferred and paid for by the carbon fund. So it doesn't mean that if there's something like a fire that releases CO2, that is automatically a reversal. We know that would lead to less emission reductions, but it doesn't mean that that you necessarily have a reversal of previously paid for or transferred emission reductions. So just to explain that in a little bit more detail, let me give you an example here in the table. So let's assume we have a program where the reference level is set at 100 tons of CO2 per year. So it's net, it was an average annual emissions, and the average annual emissions in the accounting area in this example is 100. So year 1, year 2, year 3, we have the same value, 100 tons of CO2. Now, the program is being implemented, and the actual emissions are, for example, 80, 90, 80. So if we would do a monitoring event after 3 years with a verification, the cumulative baseline will be 300, 100 plus 100 plus 100, but the cumulative actual emissions will be 250. So in that case, you could go to the carbon fund and you would say, well, we've reduced emissions by 50, and we would like to get paid for that. And the carbon fund would say, great, it's verified, payment is getting made. Now you continue your program for the next 2 years. So year 4, year 5, baseline remains the same, 100. But in these years, actual emissions go up. So your emissions are like 110, 120. So when we go to a second verification at the end of year 5, your cumulative baseline will be 500, 5 times 100. Your cumulative actual emissions will be 480. So you still have emission reductions. Emission reductions of 20, which is the difference between the 500 and the 480. But remember, previously the carbon fund had paid you for 50. So that's what we call a reversal. In this case, there will be a reversal of 30. Because you've been paid for 50. Actual cumulative at the second verification is only 20. So there's been a reversal of 30 credits. And those credits will need to be compensated somehow. What the methodological framework says is, first of all, you need to, again, in the same way as we were talking about displacement and leakage, the emphasis is on the sound program design and implementation. So there's ways where you can go and reduce the risk of reversals. Better fire management, designing activities that will create long-term sustainable emission reductions because the activities make sense for the people who are doing them, not just because of the carbon, but also because they make financial sense, they improve the agriculture, things like that. Now we realize that there's some reversal things that you will not be able to manage just through program design. And that's where the methodological framework requires that the ER program develops what we call a reversal management mechanism. So some way to deal with the reversals if they occur. Now the methodological framework says there's two options. One is that the program develops their own mechanism, and that might be based on something that the country is already developing. The other option is that you use a buffer, a carbon fund specific buffer. And this buffer will be managed by the carbon fund. It's going to be ER program specific. The exact modalities and procedures for it are still to be determined. But what has been decided is that the minimum set aside of that will be 10%, while the maximum set aside is 40%. Since the carbon fund is, again, scheduled to end in 2020, the carbon fund buffer will also end with the carbon fund in 2020. That means that the methodological framework also requires that if you use the carbon fund buffer, you need to develop a post-carbon fund buffer reversal management mechanism by 2019. So just to summarize the carbon accounting. So we started by saying we have a reference level, and then we report and we verify the actual emissions in the accounting area. So that leads to a volume of emission reductions. Now, if you remember when we were talking about uncertainty, there is a set aside of a number of ERs to reflect the level of uncertainty associated with the estimation of the emission reductions. So that set aside is a percentage of your ER volume. So out of the big blue bar, part of it will be set aside in a buffer to deal with the uncertainty. Then the carbon fund will buy a percentage of the volume. So let's assume that the orange striped bit of the bar is what the carbon fund buys. Then you need to find something to deal with reversals. And if you use the carbon fund buffer, then there will be a set aside of emission reductions in that buffer to deal with the risk of reversals, which is a percentage of the emission reductions purchased. So that's another slice out of your blue bar. And then what's left is emission reductions that you could potentially sell to other buyers or other programs. So carbon accounting, I know it's a lot of information, but sort of the key points to remember is that deforestation always needs to be included as an activity, degradation if it's significant, uncertainties needs to be dealt with and is set aside in the buffer. Reference levels are based on historic annual average emissions, unless you're an HFLD country. And reversals that cannot be managed otherwise are dealt with through a reversal management mechanism. So I see a lot of activity on the chat box. I can imagine there's a lot of questions on this particular topic. I'm just going to ask Nina to give us the sort of one or two top questions so I can try to answer those now before we move into the rest of the presentation.
Marco, maybe we start with a very simple one from Swapnil Chaudhary, who asked, what constitutes a forest?
That's a good question. So the methodological framework says that you need to define what your forest is. I didn't mention that on the slides, but it is part of the methodological framework. You need to have a forest definition. If that is a definition which is different from what you use for example, the UNFCCC, you would need to justify why you use that different definition. But yeah, defining what a forest is one of the first steps that is required under the methodological framework.
Esther Fach has an important question who's asking, how were the countries that qualify for the 0.1% adjustment identified?
So when you come to the carbon fund and you think you are a country which has historic low deforestation and high forest cover, you will need to justify that to the carbon fund itself. So there's different lists out there. I mean, there are different ways of establishing what these HFLD countries are. The carbon fund does not set a hard limit. So it doesn't say you're an HFLD country if your historic deforestation is lower than X. So as a country, you need to make that case yourself, basically.
Sophia Alroth is asking, or commenting, I think I missed something on how to handle the reference level when you have an upward trend in emissions. Seems to me you will lose the incentive to join RED. And there's a related question from Jennifer Lolling. Are you saying countries shouldn't choose the counting areas with high emissions because they won't be able to demonstrate emission reductions by 2020. I would have thought countries should rather target areas with high emissions.
Yeah, that was an interesting discussion when the methodological framework was designed. So the decision in the end was that the reference level is going to be based on average historic annual emissions. So the reason why I put up that slide is to show that if you have an upward trend, it creates, you need to make a big effort to be able to create emission reductions. So I'm not saying that you should not select those particular areas, but it is something to keep in mind, because when you develop a program and you're expecting emission reduction, because the Carbon Fund, it's payment for performance. We only pay for the actual emission reduction. So if you're not able to create emission reduction, you will not get a payment from the Carbon Fund. So it was a political choice to say, no, we want to use average historic emissions as the reference level. And that means that that's advantage for some countries and a disadvantage for other countries. And it will be up to you as a country to decide, if that impacts your decision to be part of the Carbon Fund or not. But it is an important consideration when you're thinking about doing a program.
There's a question from Christopher Henschel. Would measurements, carbon accounting, for example, the VCS or safeguards, for example, CCBA or FSC, carried out under voluntary systems or using the methodology of voluntary systems, be accepted if they meet the criteria and indicators of the FCPF Carbon Fund?
Yes, the methodological framework says at the beginning that you could use other standards, like, for example, VCS jurisdictional RED, as long as you can show that you still meet all the requirements of the methodological framework. So yeah, it is possible. You could apply other standards, but how exactly the process will work, we're still sorting out, but it is possible.
We see that there are a lot of other questions, and we will address them after Marco has run through the rest of the presentation, and we'll come back to these questions that still remain.
Okay, thank you, Nina. So moving on to the rest of the methodological framework. So I know carbon accounting is always one that creates a lot of questions, but there's a lot more interesting things in the methodological framework. One of those is the section on safeguards. So the Carbon Fund is managed at the moment by the World Bank, which means that any programs that come in on the Carbon Fund need to meet applicable World Bank policies and procedures, which includes the World Bank safeguards. Then on top of that, the methodological framework also requires that programs should promote and support the safeguards included in the UNFCCC guidance on RED+. So basically what people usually refer to as the Cancun safeguards. And the Met framework says the principal ways of doing this is through what we call safeguard plans. And these are documents that describe the actions to be taken by the program to eliminate or offset or reduce adverse environmental and social impacts. And depending on the requirements of the country and the findings of the World Bank, that might include things around environmental management plans, resettlement action plans, for example, if you're creating a protected area, and indigenous peoples plans. These safeguards assessments should be building on what's already happening as part of your national readiness. So if a RED country is working on readiness, they should be undertaking this national level strategic environmental and social assessment, the SESA, and develop a corresponding environmental social management framework. So the idea is that the framework will identify the sort of safeguards that might kick in depending on the actions that you're planning as part of your strategy. And the idea is really that in your ER program you have an opportunity to test out part of the RED strategy that you're developing for the national level, but then on a slightly smaller scale. So the SESA process and this ESMF process will give you a basis to develop the safeguards approach for the program. as well. So build on that process. Don't reinvent the wheel. And then use the process as well to report back. So at a minimum, you need to report back on the World Bank safeguards, so how they are complied with. And then the methodological framework also says that you need to report how the Cancun safeguards are addressed and respected. And if relevant, that information can then also feed back into the safeguards information system that you might be developing as part of your national readiness. So really the idea is that the safeguard process for the ER program builds on the national safeguards process and also helps you to enhance and develop that further. As part of the safeguards process, there's also a requirement to have a feedback and grievance redress mechanism. So this is a way to accept, assess, and resolve stakeholder feedback or complaints about either the preparation or the implementation of the ER program. And again, under the national readiness, you should be already preparing a feedback and grievance redress mechanism. It's part of the readiness process. So again, the idea is that let's build on that. Let's not do a separate mechanism for the program, but the methodological framework requires that the mechanism is operational by the time the program starts. So maybe as part of your readiness, you're designing your grievance redress mechanism now. Before you can start the program, you need to make sure that it's implemented at least then in the area where you're doing your program. So if the mechanism requires certain actions in certain provinces, and one of those provinces is the area that you've selected for your program area, making sure that at least what you have designed is up and running in that specific area. And that also means that you need to show that there's adequate expertise and resources for operating that grievance and redress mechanism. So, safeguards, key points, you need to comply with the World Bank safeguard operational policies and procedures, promote and support university guidance, the safeguards plans that help to manage the impacts, and there needs to be a feedback and grievance redress mechanism in place. The next part of the methodological framework talks about sustainable program design and implementation. So the basic of that is that you know what your drivers of deforestation is and that you have actions to address that. So as I said before, the idea with these ER programs is really that they build on your national readiness process where you should already be analyzing your drivers, developing a strategy, etc. And what the Common Fund really wants to see is that through your emission reduction program, you can test and pilot parts of your strategy, and then you can help to improve your own strategy by the lessons that you learn in the program. So the methodological framework requires you to identify the drivers and then propose the measures to address the drivers. Part of that is an assessment of land resource tenure regimes. Again, already as part of your national readiness, you should be doing a national assessment of land resource tenure regimes. If it's necessary for the implementation of the program, you could complement that by another assessment specifically for the accounting area, but as much as possible it should build on the process that you're doing as part of the national readiness. And then the findings can feed into the design and implementation of the program, if they are necessary to make the ER program possible. Where the methodological framework also says it makes a link is with the ability to transfer title to emission reduction. I will come back to that in the next slide as well. Another important part of sustainable program design is the benefit sharing mechanisms. So what the methodological framework says is you'll create benefits, and how benefits are defined in the context of the methodological framework is that benefits are the monetary and non-monetary benefits resulting from the payment of the emission reductions. So you'll be creating emission reductions, and then there will be payments for those emission reductions, and that money can be used in different ways. You could make cash payments to certain beneficiaries, to, for example, payment for environmental services, or you can use that money to pay for and support certain activities. So that will be the sort of non-monetary results. Now, as part of the methodological framework, as part of the requirements of the Carbon Fund, you need to define a benefit sharing plan, which defines how these benefits will be shared. And this benefit sharing plan is the result of a consultation process that should lead to broad community support, and that can build again on your national readiness process, including stakeholder processes that you're already doing there. Then the methodological framework requires that the benefit sharing plan includes things like the categories of beneficiaries, the type of benefits that will be shared, distribution criteria, etc. Doesn't mean that it has to be saying, okay, farmer X gets $2, but at least you should define the broad categories of beneficiaries and explain how the money is going to be distributed and how that will be used to support the program and ensure that the drivers of deforestation will remain addressed. So in that previous slide, we defined benefits as the monetary and non-monetary benefits resulting from the payment of the emission reductions. But then obviously all these programs also create a lot of other benefits, livelihoods, governance structures, biodiversity, ecosystem services, etc. In the context of the methodological framework and in the context of the Carbon Fund, these are called non-carbon benefits. So it's still benefits of the program, they're still very important, but that they're not directly resulting from the payment for the emission reductions. What the methodological framework requires, what the Carbon Fund requires, is that you identify potential non-carbon benefits and then identify what we call priority non-carbon benefits. So these priority non-carbon benefits are the ones that you think the program will actively generate and or enhance. Then you will be expected to actually report on this generation or enhancement of these priority non-carbon benefits. This reporting doesn't mean that you necessarily have to quantify everything. So there's no prescribed methodology for measuring or reporting these. The Carbon Fund realizes that, for example, biodiversity might be very difficult to quantify, but you will need to come up with some sort of approach where you propose how you will be reporting and how you will be sort of estimating the effect. But that can be qualitative as well as quantitative. So key points on sustainable program design and implementation. You need to identify your drivers of deforestation. You are encouraged to show how the program contributes to progress towards clarifying land and resource tenure. You'll need to have a benefit sharing plan that deals with the monetary and non-monetary benefits. And then on top of that, you need to identify priority non-carbon benefits. Last part of the methodological framework is ER program and transactions. So earlier on, I mentioned this concept of an ERPA, an emission reduction payment agreement. So if a country or a program enters into the Carbon Fund, there will be this contract, and this contract will say, okay, we will pay you for these emission reductions, but in exchange you will transfer the title to these emission reductions to the fund. That doesn't mean that it doesn't impact title of land or title of activities or anything like that. It's just that the emission reductions that are being transferred, that are being paid for, need to be transferred, because potentially some of the Carbon Fund participants could use those emission reductions, for example, to show their own carbon neutrality. So the first step for doing that is that whoever is developing the program, what we call the ER program entity, needs to demonstrate that they have the authority to actually sign this contract with the Carbon Fund. And this authority needs to be clarified at the beginning, and that could be based on an existing legal and regulatory framework. Again, as part of your national readiness, most countries will be thinking about this sort of institutional setup. And in that institutional setup, one of the questions might be, okay, who has the right to go out and basically get paid for emission reductions. So you could provide a reference to this regulatory framework, or maybe there's a letter from a relevant overarching governmental authority, presidency, Ministry of Finance, etc. So that's step one. Program entity demonstrates that it has the authority to enter into the ERPA. Then the second step is that you then need to be able to show that you have the right to transfer the title and receive the payments. And that can be through different means as well, and it really depends on the legal situation in your country, who has the original title to emission reductions. Is that the people who own the land? Is that the people who do the activities? Is it the government, etc.? And that whoever has that right needs to be able to transfer that to the carbon fund, and that can be done through different things. Could be done through laws or regulations, could be done through sub-arrangements. So, for example, when you do your benefit sharing plan and you agree with certain groups that they will be beneficiaries of this program, as part of that discussion you might want to talk about carbon rights, etc. Sometimes, or maybe in some countries, there will be a situation where this condition cannot be fully met. Cannot be fully met at the time you're signing an ERPA. It might not be fully met when you're doing your first monitoring, or it might still be questioned later on. The Methodological Framework puts in certain requirements for when this occurs. So if this ability to transfer is not fully demonstrated at the signing of the ERPA, that might affect the volume of emission reductions that the government funds will buy. If it's still unclear and contested at the time of the transfer of emission reductions, that might mean that part of your emission reductions that you've created cannot be paid for, even although they were part of the original contract. And if they become contested after the transfer, then the contract will have certain remedies to deal with it, and that might include another set-aside, another buffer, depending on the risk for this situation. We realize that this is something that for a lot of countries is new. A lot of countries are still in the process of figuring it out. So really, through the Carbon Fund, we're trying to pilot different solutions here and see which ones works best. Then the final bit is that to avoid having multiple claims to an ER, so to avoid that they get used twice or three times, or maybe paid twice or three times, there's a requirement that you have a program projects database, which keeps track of all the projects and all the programs doing RED, and that there is some sort of mechanism to ensure that emission reductions are not transferred twice or used again. So the idea is really that once the carbon fund has made a payment for the emission reduction and that transfer has occurred, that as a country you cannot use that again. For example, you cannot use it again to show your own carbon neutrality as a country, but basically it needs to be subtracted. So there's a requirement to have something in place there, which can be a registry or some sort of program database. Again, we know that a lot of countries have started thinking about it. It's still early days. The FCPF is working on helping you with it. So the idea is to come up with good practice, some ideas of how this could work in the meantime. So key points on the transactions: you must be able to transfer title. Whoever signs a contract with carbon funds, and that can be based on sub-arrangements, benefit sharing arrangements, laws, etc. And there needs to be arrangements in place to avoid multiple claims to emission reductions. So again, this was a very quick overview of what the methodological framework is. Very much encourage you to go and read the whole thing. There's a lot of details that we cannot really cover in a webinar like this. The full text is available on the website in English, Spanish, and French. So go and find your own language there. We have time for questions now, but if you're a red country and you have remaining questions, go to your focal point within the FMT and they will make sure that it gets to the appropriate persons. So I think there's still a lot of questions going on. Nina?
Thank you, Marco, for the excellent presentation, and thank you for the very informed audience for the excellent question. We now have 30 minutes left for questions, and I suggest we take about 15 minutes of questions on the second part of the presentation and then go back for another 15 minutes on questions related to carbon accounting. Before we go into the question, I just wanted to remind everybody that the presentation, the whole seminar will be online within one day, and you can go back to it and listen to it again if you missed something. And you can now also go into the presentation and scroll through it if you wanted to go back to the slide and formulate your question. So I wanted to go straight into non-carbon benefits since I see a lot of questions popping up. For example, Christopher Henschel is asking, he just scrolled away, how shall or should the delivery of non-carbon benefits be demonstrated? And related to that, must the program deliver priority non-carbon benefits? Is there any payment for priority non-carbon benefits? And Luis Saldago asks, if there are more non-carbon benefits, will that influence the carbon price in any way?
So the discussion on pricing in the Carbon Fund is still ongoing, but it's very clear that there's not going to be like a premium payment for the non-priority, for the priority carbon benefits. But it is an important selection criteria. As I said before, there's only going to be room for a limited number of countries in the Carbon Fund, and what the selection criteria say is, these non-carbon benefits, especially these priority non-carbon benefits, are very much a part of the selection criteria. They, as I said before, in terms of the pricing, there will not be a price premium per se, but it might be an argument that a red country might use in the negotiations. In terms of how you're going to monitor it, as I said, the methodological framework just says, okay, you need to come up with some way to provide information on these priority non-carbon benefits. But it's not specific that you need to quantify things. So as a country or as a program, you can come up with your own solutions, and you need to, basically the idea is that you report on that. But the results of the program in the end is measured in emission reductions. So if you thought you would have certain priority non-carbon benefits, and you're not delivering as much as possible, or as you thought before, that does not necessarily disqualify you to get paid for the emission reductions. Keeping in mind that when you design the program and when you talk to stakeholders, at least my personal expectation would be that a lot of the stakeholders are going to be very much interested in these priority non-carbon benefits. So to ensure that the program is successful, you really need to work hard to make sure that you also deliver on these priority non-carbon benefits.
There's a question on safeguards, also from Christopher Henschel. How should compliance with World Bank safeguards be demonstrated? Or maybe who would?
So the World Bank has its own procedures when it comes to its safeguards. So basically, there will be a process where where World Bank staff will be supervising the program. So there will be a reporting and sort of verification process on safeguards, which will deal with the World Bank part of it. And then the World Bank will be reporting that back to the Carbon Fund. What we want to avoid is that you have a separate process of monitoring or reporting on the World Bank safeguards, and then a separate process on the UNFCCC/Cancun safeguards. So that's why the methodological framework is really encouraging you to look at that in an integrated way and take both of them into account when, for example, you're designing your safeguards information system.
There's a question on transfer of benefits from Luis Salgado. What is the fund's responsibility if the benefits are not transferred to the final beneficiary as agreed in the benefit sharing mechanism?
Okay, so that's where, for example, this this FGRM, so this grievance and redress mechanism, would kick in. So if payments are made to the Carbon Fund, as part of the World Bank supervision, we will be looking at the implementation of the benefit sharing plan, and in the monitoring, the country or the program will also be required to report on the implementation of the benefit sharing plan. So if once money has been transferred, the country will report, the World Bank will supervise, but also if certain stakeholders, certain beneficiaries feel that what was agreed on is not being implemented, then they should go to this grievance redress mechanism for the program and for the country, and make sure that that reaches the appropriate authorities in the country.
There's a question on the right to transfer title from Matt Somerville. He's asking, but the underlying assumption is that the government must have the right to transfer title, not local right holders.
The assumption is that whoever signs the contract with the Carbon Fund has the right to transfer it to the Carbon Fund. So if that whoever signs the contract is a government entity, doesn't mean that the government entity necessarily has the rights. The rights can still sit with beneficiaries, landowners, etc. It just means that whoever signs the contract with the Carbon Fund needs to find a way to first transfer the title to them, and then they are allowed to transfer the title to the Carbon Fund. What we want to avoid is that somebody signs a contract with the Carbon Fund, for example, a government entity, it could be an NGO as well. We make a payment, and then the rights holders in the ER program area say, hold on, they might have signed a contract with you, but they never came to me. They don't have rights to sell the carbon on my behalf. So it's up to the entity who's signing the contract to make sure that they have the right to transfer the title based on the legal circumstances in the specific country.
There's the question on participation of stakeholders from Andres Camargo, who I believe must be from Colombia. He's asking how is a small country organization, or can they participate in projects with the World Bank in Colombia, I'm assuming within the context of the Carbon Fund?
Yeah, so the idea is that the program is the result of a stakeholder consultation process. So if you're, for example, in Colombia, and you know that your government or a institution in Colombia is planning to submit an idea to the Carbon Fund, and that happens to be in the province or the state where you're working, there should be a process where you can be part of that process, be part of the design, and can also have a discussion with that entity on how you can contribute to the program, and then how you could potentially benefit. But that's a process that needs to be managed in the country itself. That's not a process that's managed by the World Bank. It's a stakeholder consultation process in the country itself.
Here's a question from Lulu Licasa Nefabas on ER benefits. What do we mean by ER benefits? Does it mean only the net income going to pocket, and or the total income used to implement activities to reduce deforestation, degradation?
So when we're talking about benefits, we're talking about the payment for the emission reductions. So the program creates emission reductions, a certain amount, let's say 1 million, and then there's a price per emission reductions. So the price times the emission reduction will give you a pot of money. The Carbon Funds will make a payment equivalent to that to whoever signed the emission reduction purchase agreement. So that is the money you get after the program is implemented. Then the benefit sharing plan should have discussed, okay, once that money comes in, how do we use that money? Where does that money go to? What we realize is that some of that money might have to be used to keep the program going. Some of that money might be for monitoring purposes. Some of that money just covering certain costs. And some of that money might go, or should go, to the people who are actually creating the emission reductions through certain activities. It's going to be very program and country specific what the best way of doing that is. Sometimes it may be payment for environmental services. Maybe sometimes it's investments in certain activities. It's up to the country to have that discussion and to find out what the best way is of using that money to continue creating emission reductions. But what needs to be clear in this benefit sharing plan is, of that net pot of money that comes in, how much of that goes to the beneficiaries, how much of it is used just to run the program. And then even if you're talking about the beneficiaries, I mean, beneficiaries could also be an NGO who's running a certain program, and they might want to use that money to cover the cost of their extension service, for example. So, beneficiaries doesn't necessarily need to be, an individual, but it could also be a group or an entity.
There are a couple of questions on scale from various people. Lulu Nefabas is asking, what do you, sorry, it just scrolled. I'll go to Luis Saldago's question. Is it possible for a country to have more than one program with you, considering that they may have areas with significant different circumstances? And the related question from Lulu was, is there any indication of the minimum forest land areas to qualify for an ER program? And a similar question from Jonathan Rodriguez, whether projects that are lower than of smaller scale than a national RED program could qualify as well.
Okay, so in terms of more than one program per country, there's nothing in the rules that says that cannot happen, but it seems unlikely. Since the Carbon Fund only has money to pilot a limited number of programs, and the idea is to really learn from a wide diversity, it seems unlikely that there will be a selection where there's more than one program in the country. Although we realize that some of the countries are very big and would have an opportunity to actually have a number of programs. So my expectation, although it's not a hard to pass rule, is probably not more than one program per country. So in terms of the minimum size, again, it depends a little bit on the country's circumstances. So some countries are small, some countries are big. The size of a district or a kabupaten in Indonesia, might be the same as a small country in Central America. So there's no hard boundary. What I would encourage you is to go to the FCPF website. If you go to the meetings, the Carbon Fund meetings, all the ideas that have been presented to the Carbon Fund so far are public. There you will find the pins in the presentations. And that will give you some ideas of the sizes that countries are thinking about. And you will see it varies a lot. In the last Carbon Fund meeting that we had in April, the range was from like 2 million hectares all the way up to 17 million hectares. So it really comes back to that question that I posed in the beginning. You're going to have this accounting area where you're going to do your reference level in your MRV. How much of that accounting area can you actually influence? How much program can you do in a relatively short period? Also keeping in mind again that what the Carbon Fund will do is to pay for performance. So first you need to implement the activities, and only when the activities are implemented and the emission reductions are created, that's when the payment for the Carbon Fund will come. So it's good to be ambitious, but also be realistic. And yes, just to be sure, so we're not saying that you need to do a country-level program per se. Most of the ideas that we're getting so far are either provinces or states, or maybe a collection of provinces. Most of them are subnational. There's only one actually that is aiming for a national program at
There's a question that just came in from Christopher Henschel that relates to that. That is, does the framework provide any advice for assembling individual projects that are already verified through voluntary standards into a larger project for the fund? And I'll take that then as a segue to go back to carbon accounting.
So the methodological framework recognizes that there might be a situation like that. But what the methodological framework will not do, and what the carbon fund will not do, is like have individual contracts with projects. So you can have projects, that's fine. But the scale that the fund will operate will be the bigger scale, for example, the province. So it will be up to you as a country to find your own solution how you deal with these projects. If a project is already selling to the voluntary market, as I said in the section on the transaction, it's very important to make sure that the carbon fund is not paying for the same emission reduction twice. So if it's already sold to the voluntary market, you cannot sell the same emission reductions to the carbon fund again. So you will need to find a way to exclude those emission reductions. That could be that you either exclude the area of the whole project, or if you keep the project as part of the program for the carbon fund, you'll find a way to ensure that there's no double counting of the emission reductions.
All right, let's go to some questions on carbon accounting. Luis Salgado was asking, is it possible to justify a longer or shorter period to define the reference levels? And let's keep the answer short so we can...
Yeah. So as I said before, the maximum period is 15 years. And you need to be as close as possible to 2012. So in theory, it could be 1997 to 2012 is sort of the maximum period. If you want to go further back, you need to come up with a very good justification. And I don't expect that there will be opportunity to have a big gap between, let's say, the 2012. So maybe you can go back to 2010, 2011. So let's say 2000 to 2010. If you go further back than that, it will be difficult to justify.
There's a question on buffers, again from Luis Salgado. What happens to the buffer emission reductions at the end of the period if nothing happened?
Yeah.
Are you going to buy them also? Is there a program free to sell them at that moment?
So the idea is that at the end of the lifetime of the carbon fund, if there's still emission reductions left in the buffer. As I said, the carbon fund runs only until 2020 and the buffer will only run until 2020. But when the payments for the emission reductions are made, there's an expectation that we're not just paying for emission reductions up to 2020, but we're paying for emission reductions which are long-term and sustainable. So that's why there's a requirement that if you use the carbon fund buffer by 2019, you identify or propose an alternative mechanism that will kick in after 2020. Hopefully by that time there will be a RED mechanism on the UNFCCC, so maybe there's a reversal management mechanism there. Maybe you're transferring to another standard which has its own reversal management mechanism, or maybe you find something that's country specific. The idea is that whatever is left in the buffer in 2020 will be transferred into this new system. That's easier said than done. We're not quite sure yet how that's going to work. If the new system is also buffered, it might be pretty straightforward. If the new system is something else, it could be something else, then we still need to figure out how exactly that's going to work.
There's a question on forest fires from Sophia Alroth. If there's a large forest fire due to special conditions that would make any attempt to prevent fires futile, there would still be reversal, no sort of emergency exit.
Yeah, in principle, the reversal events are both anthropogenic and natural. There's not an act of God clause type thing at the moment. If something major happens, I mean, if there's a country which, there's a volcano eruption or something like that, I'm sure we'll find a way to deal with it. But in principle, the idea is that everything is covered, so it would indeed be a reversal.
There's a question from Yvonne Hargita. Countries are related to IPCC guidelines. Countries are encouraged to use the most recent IPCC guidelines, which would be the IPCC guidelines of 2006. Why is there no statement regarding harvested wood products, which could represent a potential loophole when calculated on the basis of IPCC 2006? That's why for accounting the KP supplements were developed.
Yeah. So when we were discussing the methodological framework, we did talk about harvested wood products. Basically, the conclusion there was that it wasn't considered part of RED necessarily, of the 5 RED activities. So we have proposals. For example, if you go to the ERP in Costa Rica, you will see that they have as part of their program that they're thinking about the use of harvested wood products, but any emission or emission reductions associated with that are excluded from the program and the payments under the Carbon Fund.
Another question on MRV and reference levels. Who will review, again from Yvonne, who will review the reference levels and the MRV under the Carbon Fund? Will inventory compliers or experts be involved? Yeah. And that will be the last question, as
we're running out of time. Yeah. So the Carbon Fund is still discussing and figuring out the assessment process. The expectation is that there will be technical experts who would be reviewing the reference level, and also when you do your reporting, that would be assessed by a similar panel. How exactly that panel, who will consist of that panel, what the assessment process is, how that assessment process will cooperate with the processes being developed on the UNFCCC, we're still being discussing. So watch this space, keep following what's happening in the Carbon Fund, and then hopefully some of those answers will come pretty soon.
Any questions? Okay, we are running out of time. We will have to close the questions here. If you have burning questions that remain, please contact your if you're a country, please contact our focal point, and we'll get back to you with the responses.
Okay, so then, let's say on my behalf, I want to thank everybody for participating and for hanging in. I know it's a lot of information. Again, go look at the presentation. It's been recorded, so you'll receive an email with the link, and you can look at it again, read the methodological framework. If you're a RED country, contact the FMT directly, and we can help you with more questions. And if you're thinking about developing an ER program, good luck.
Well, we want to thank the for participating in this webinar. As we said, the presentation and the recording of this webinar will be available within 1 day on this website. You'll also receive the link by email. If you have feedback on how we can improve this seminar, please feel free to provide your feedback. We'll be glad to take it into account. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day, afternoon.